Good evening, friends, and thank you for joining us this evening for the online lecture, The Challenge of Abstraction by Ranjit Hoskote. The talk is being held in conjunction with Abstract Notations, an online exhibition presented by Gallery Espace. Abstract Notations traces the practice of 25 contemporary artists and 5 masters from India. I'll just name the five names. Ganesh Haloi, Nagji Patel, Nasreen Mohammadi, Shobha Bhruta, and Zarina Hashmi. The curatorial praxis of the exhibition is based on the 5 elements of nature: earth, water, fire, air, and ether, as the Panchabhuta and Tanmatras. Abstract Notations proposes an adaptation of these ancient concepts into contemporary sensibility. Expanding into a larger perspective, the exhibition proposes several critical subtexts and connotations of political pragmatism, ecological concerns, scientific attributes, and metaphysical quality. For those of you who haven't seen the exhibition, do have a look. It's online at the Gallery Espace Instagram profile. I'd like to now introduce and invite Ranjit Hoskote, poet, cultural theorist, curator, and art critique. Ranjit Hoskote will discuss abstraction and its perpetual challenges in India, indicating its proximity to culture, cosmology, and classical music. Interestingly, Hoskote's debut curatorial project, Hinged by Light, at Pandole Art Gallery in Bombay 1994, concerned the practices of 3 abstractionists, Mehli Gobai, Prabhakar Kolte, and Yogesh Rawal. In 2013, Hoskote and Mehli Gobai co-curated Nothing is Absolute, a survey exhibition of Indian abstraction and its contexts at the Jahangir Nicholson Gallery, CSMVS Museum, Bombay. Hoskote also curated Lakshman Shrestha, The Infinite Project, at the CSMVS Jahangir Nicholson Art Foundation in 2016, and a retrospective scale exhibition of M.F. Hussain, Horses of the Sun, at the Mataf Museum, Doha in 2019. And with Nancy Adajania, Hoskote co-curated Don't Ask Me About Color, a retrospective of Mehli Gobai, NGMA, Bombay 2020, which most of us have missed seeing due to the pandemic. So we hope to see it in a different form, a book, a publication, or another exhibition. In his role as an art critique, Hoskote has authored a critical biography as well as a major retrospective study of the painter Jahangir Sabawala, and also monographs on the artists Atul Dodia, Tayyab Mehta, Sudhir Patwardhan, Baiju Parthan, Bharti Khair, and G.R. Irana. He has written major essays on other leading Indian artists, including, among others, Geef Patel, Bhupen Khakkar, Akbar Padamsi, S.H. Raza, Ram Kumar, J. Swaminathan, Mehli Gobai, Vivan Sundaram, Lakshman Shrestha, Prabhakar Kolte, Ganesh Haloi, Surendran Nair, Jitish Kalat, the Rax Media Collective, Shilpa Gupta, and Sudarshan Shetty. Hoskote has also speculated in various essays on the nature of futurative art, possessed of an intermedia orientation, and which combines critical resistance with expressive pleasure. He writes that the modern artwork is often elegiac in nature. It mourns the loss of beauty through scission and absence. It carries within its very structure a lament for the loss of beauty. It was in 2011 that I've had the privilege of assisting Hoskote, who was a curator for the first National Pavilion of India at the Venice Biennale, titled Everyone Agrees It's About to Explode. It included works by the artists Zarina Hashmi, Gigi Scaria, Praneet Soy, and the Desire Machine Collective. I now invite Ranjit Hoskote to take us through his lecture, The Challenge of Abstraction. Thank you, Ranjit. You're muted.
Okay, can you see and hear me now?
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you very much indeed for that warm and generous introduction. And it's great to be here. I also want to thank Renu Modi of Gallery Espas and her team, Gargi and other colleagues for this occasion. And I'm, I was really quite moved on hearing the multitude of sins for which I've clearly been guilty over the last 30 years and more, as you sum them up. But it really has been a life spent in the visual arts and in another part of what I do in literature. And in the course of which, through many different conversations and collaborations, I think I've had the occasion to reflect on the number of histories that we inherit, and they are plural. So when we speak, for instance, of Indian abstraction, we are looking simultaneously at a particular genealogy that we have here in terms of abstraction, but we are also looking at the ways in which the different histories of global abstraction have impinged on our practice here. And what is profoundly vital about our scene is that there are several generations of artists practicing simultaneously. And I think this has for a long time been a very particular feature of our art world, not only in abstraction, but across the board. There's a way in which we don't simply move on from one generation to the next, or what seems to be stylistically or historically relevant at one point to the next. There is, in the art world, as in many other domains of collective life in India, there is a tremendous sense of people of different trajectories, different experiences, different preoccupations, working together in dialogue for the most part, and really responsive to one another's practices. And that, to me, in the exhibition that you've just outlined, in its novel manner of being on Instagram, it kind of dramatizes this. And in what I have to say today as well, I'm going to be dwelling on some of these factors. So there's going to be two parts to what I have to say today. In the first, I'm going to essentially put in place some of these histories of abstraction that I've talked about. And in the second part, I'm going to speak over my slides. In my old-fashioned way, I still refer to these things as slides, although they have absolutely no materiality. They're all pixels, really. But I'll come to that as part two. So let me begin by also, in the way in which webinars go, I noticed that people are also reaching out via chat and so on and so forth. But for the most part, I'll bracket that, and we'll take responses later. Yeah. So I'll begin by dwelling a little bit on how abstraction seems to be widely understood. People tend to think of it as something that draws away from the world as we experience it through our senses, through our anxieties, through our everydayness. So abstraction is sometimes understood to refer to a more transcendent domain, a more spiritual domain. And I have to say, with great respect to many friends and colleagues, I am sometimes troubled by the amount of mumbo jumbo that attends abstraction, because it tends to occlude or cover up the fact that abstraction is also perfectly capable of bringing us face to face with the urgencies of the human adventure, the urgencies of belonging, of alienation, of love, of spiritual quest, of perplexity. And it is able to expand our consciousness and our imagination in a panoramic way. And I'll say more about that as we go along. Part of the problem, of course, if it's a problem, part of the situation is that many leading abstractionists, whether here or elsewhere, have in fact emphasized the spiritual nature of their work. So as I go along this evening, I want to unpack the dilemmas implicit in abstraction. So my title for this evening, The Challenge of Abstraction, refers both to the challenges that abstraction faces and the challenges that it poses to us as artists, as viewers, as people who experience art. So uh, let me first go very quickly through a received understanding of the global history of abstraction within the larger unfolding story of modernism, which, as we know now, is not a simple singular story. It's actually a collection of intertwining stories, convergences, tangents, lacunae, and this is what we inherit. This is what we have to look at closely. I say this sometimes to my students when I teach, that do not expect a linear teleological account of modernism as, you know, this cultural energy that proceeds step by step and phase by phase. It moves ahead, it moves back, it moves sideways, and you have to stay the course. But broadly, there are three great moments in the way in which we understand abstraction in the 20th century. The first of these, of course, has to do with the emergence of abstraction in the first 2 decades of the 20th century in Central and in West Europe. And the key figures that we associate with that phase are, of course, Kandinsky, Klee, Mondrian, and the circles that developed around them. Now, for Kandinsky, one of whose works, of course, we know is concerning the spiritual and art, the key move was to get away from retinally obvious reality and to move inwards to a more spiritual space, which he felt he could achieve through the painterly. He also had an elaborate theory, which I won't go into right now, of how, through a series of vibrations as manifest across color and across sound, one could actually achieve a sense of being in the presence of transcendence. Interestingly, Mondrian also made a journey from a clear engagement with landscape to the purities, as he saw them, of structure and of geometrical form. Once again, Mondrian genuinely believed that this kind of refinement of the picture space and of pictorial reality could both reflect and bring about a spiritual purity. Klee had a somewhat different journey, and I'm not even going to think of him necessarily as an abstractionist. I think for Klee, the key explosion, the percussive explosion in his consciousness was his visit to North Africa, his fresh experience of a different ecology, a different climate, a different chroma, a different color spectrum. And ever after, he really worked with what I like to think of as a somewhat hieroglyphic approach to picture making, which emphasized sign and emphasized color. I also want to say that Kandinsky and Mondrian, among a number of other modernists and abstractionists, were both theosophists. They were part of a global religious movement, which really had a very large number of followers in the early decades of the 20th century. So they were not simply making formal shifts. They were also quite concerned and quite convinced that what they were doing as picture makers, as image makers, as painters, was part of a larger spiritual project. And I want us to keep that in mind, because we may return to this when we discuss it. Somehow there tends to be an identification of the project of the modern with the project of the secular. And we are very stringent about this when we think about our artists in India, because we, of course, approach the question of the secular and the modern from our own complex cultural situation. I just want to put it out there that some of the key modernists were in fact religious believers. They were not just spiritualists, they also had definite religious beliefs. So a preoccupation with the occult, with the spiritual, with the religious imagination is actually part and parcel of this larger and more complex global modern that I want us to think about. So that was phase one, as I'd like to think of it. I'd also like us to keep in mind that even as we think about these great names, we don't think enough about some of their fellow travelers, people who might have gotten a little ahead of them, people who sustained them. I'm thinking particularly of Gabriele Münter, who was for a time Kandinsky's partner, and was also a painter of distinction and a thinker of distinction. When we think about this first phase of abstraction, we need to bring her back to mind. She's not thought of enough, and we need to. Part of what I want to do here is also to draw attention to some of these other figures who should be brought back into the story. So I'm going to move now from essentially Central and West Europe in the first 2 decades of the 20th century now to another phase, to the Soviet avant-gardes, who really got going after 1917, after the Soviet Revolution, but had in fact been active also from the dawn of the 20th century. I'm thinking here of the constructivists, the suprematists. I'm thinking of artists like L. Lissitzky, of Kazimir Malevich. And these were people who were caught up in the drama of a political and a social revolution with which they had a vexed relationship. On the one hand, artists like Lissitzky, who inflected their art practice with their preoccupations with design and with graphic art and with architecture. These people like Lissitzky and his circle were more aligned with the revolution. Lissitzky, Taklin, they genuinely felt that their art might have something to contribute to the communist realignment, in fact, a radical transformation of society. People like Malevich were at a certain distance to the revolution. On the one hand, Malevich was, of course, simplifying, refining, if you will, purifying his forms, developing a highly geometricized vocabulary. But Malevich came to this from a preoccupation with what was called cosmism, which was also a spiritual movement of transformation with a wager on utopia. So with the Soviet artists, I would read abstraction there as being in a contested zone between two very different understandings of what utopia was. Many of these artists, alongside poets like Mayakovsky, for instance, were caught up in these questions. On the one hand, as artists or as believers in one or another cosmological system, they felt that utopia might arrive through a refinement of the spirit. On the other hand, they were caught up with a stridently and militantly atheistic political revolution, which had its own understanding of utopia. We all know where this went. If eventually there was a split between the political avant-garde and the artistic avant-garde. Many artists, many poets paid the price. They either went into internal or external exile. Some of them ended up in the gulags. And that's a narrative which we can hold for another time. But I want to put this in play for now, only from the point of view of saying that abstraction has never been apolitical, especially through the Soviet experience. You see how it actually played a very, very strong role in cultural politics and politics at large. I now move continents and periods and go to the third phase of this global history of abstraction. And I'm thinking here of the School of New York, post-World War II. We're thinking here of the late 1940s and the early 1950s, where artists like Jackson Pollock, Barnett Newman, Adolf Gottlieb, Mark Rothko, and so on, are active in a New York that is, like the cities of Europe, less immediately affected, but certainly greatly affected in social and cultural terms. It's waking up to the post-World War II period. And you have these artists who have a certain notion of the sublime. They are taken up with the idea that they can find or create a vocabulary that goes back to sacred consciousness, that in a very bodied way can turn the painted surface into a space of spiritual transformation. Once again, the themes recur, but the situation is quite different. Also, art historically, the situation is different. Whilst both in the Mondrian and Kandinsky kind of ethos and in the Soviet avant-gardes, the artists were themselves their own propagandists, if you will, the situation with the School of New York was somewhat different. Of course, they were their own propagandists. Newman wrote, gave radio talks. Pollock gave interviews. Rothko wrote. But they also had the imprimatur of a pope of art history, Clement Greenberg. Many of you know this already, of course. But I put it out there because in this phase of global abstraction, you have a convergence of artistic practice, as well as an art critic who has very, very strong views on what modernism is. For Greenberg, it resided in going back to exactly what the medium could offer. So painting for Greenberg could express itself most fully by achieving the planing down to pigment, to color, and to the flatness of surface. So what some but not all of the abstract expressionists were doing, their pictorial interests and his critical interests actually coincided, but they sometimes also escaped. Gottlieb, for instance, was far more concerned with biomorphic work. And this situation also does not take into account artists like Mark Tobey, who was active before the abstract expressionists, who also was experimenting with an all-over approach to the marked surface, which did not refer necessarily to anything narrative or figurative. So Mark Tobey, by the way, was a Baha'i. I will harp repeatedly on this theme of mine this evening about the religious imagination and abstraction. So Tobey was a practicing Baha'i, and his understanding of a more cosmic consciousness, of a visionary possibility for art, stemmed definitely from his religious convictions. So there's Tobey, who doesn't quite fit into Greenberg's kind of story. Then again, we don't take often enough into account until recent times. We haven't thought about Lee Krasner, Helen Frankenthaler, and a number of other women abstractionists of this period who brought to their work a different sensibility, a different bodied sense of what it means to be a person, a human being, and a painter. And in a way that was quite different from the more heroic, very masculine kind of approach of a Newman or a Rothko. So, and quite apart from New York, there was also, for instance, an abstractionist like Richard Diebenkorn on the other coast in California. And I'm thinking here of his beautiful ocean park views, which really are a recovery of the landscape genre in a more cosmic sense. What does it mean to be in the face of light, water, expanse, and color? And how does one retrieve landscape at this far grander scale of the sublime? So these were a number of the questions that abstractionists in these three phases were looking at. And for some reason, many of our histories of abstraction just sort of anchor themselves in these three phases. Much else happened, of course, through the 60s, 70s, 80s, even while people were announcing the death of abstraction, like they've announced the death of the novel, the death of the biennial. I don't know why in the cultural sphere these obituaries get written every now and again, because these forms are inexhaustible. They may sometimes go into eclipse, but they always appear again, they're resurgent. So for instance, there were developments in Latin America, in East Europe, in parts of North Africa, in the Arab world, in India. There were many, many takes in Nigeria, in Kenya. There were abstractionists who were practicing in these places, in Iran. And we are yet to write in full and cogent measure the histories of these global abstractions. People are working on it, they've been at work, and we'll have more of this expanded sense. So within that sense of an expanded set of global abstractions, I'd like to dwell a little bit now on, I'll come into my subject, India. And looking at the chronological record, I was struck by how abstraction in India really gets going after independence. And I thought to myself, can this really be true? What might explain it? I'm now speculating, I'm going out on a limb here, I'm not developing a proper historical model, but I might wonder if this had something to do with the way in which artists, however remote from the political, and they couldn't really be in late colonial India, they were preoccupied with the fate of the human figure. They were preoccupied with what it meant to produce some sense of being Indian at a time when that was contested. There were those who wanted to retrieve narratives from the way in which they imagined the past to be. There were people who had a take on the more transcendent aspects of figuration and modernism. But it seems as though the luxury of painting as an abstractionist, if you want to put it that way, I'm putting it that way, that seems to have got going only post-independence, maybe through the 50s, the 60s. And there's an incredible push-pull that you see at work, because there are two generations, for instance, that are influenced by Clay's writing. That has something to do, as I've argued elsewhere, with the fact that Clay's two great books, really were translated about 10 to 15 years apart. So there were two different generations of Indian artists who were captivated by Clay's notions of the line, the image, and how you can have a certain kind of artistic pedagogy. Equally, our Indian artists were part of a global circulation. Remember that the School of New York was not only not cut away from reality, it also became part of a Cold War politics, where this art was seen to be properly American art. This is how Greenberg presented it. And exhibitions of abstract expressionism of the School of New York went around the world. They came to parts of the global south. They certainly came through India. And there was a great excitement about these new pictorial, new artistic possibilities in India. There was also a sense that one could recover from the Indic past, a sense of the spiritual. I'm thinking here of somebody like Shankar Palshekar, for instance, of the JJ school. I'm thinking also of certain meditations of Akbar Padamsi. I'm thinking of the journey that S.H. Raza took. Many of these artists who were thinking about their plural heritage were also focusing on questions of how there might be things that lay beyond the figure, that lay beyond the narrative, that spoke of something that was timeless, perennial, and vital. There is also the loose grouping of artists that we tend to describe as the Neo-Tantric School. I think a label like that has, really done them a certain injustice. And I'll unpack that when I get to part two. So to summarize what I'm saying about Indian abstraction, I'm going to put out the possibility that there was a great desire for abstraction among many of our artists, but there was equally a great reluctance to give up the landscape, the symbol, language, and materiality. And I think that there was a formative tension here. To be a certain kind of abstractionist, you are going to produce work that resists language, that resists interpretation. You're going to produce work that aspires to the non-objective, and therefore will not allow itself to be reduced to something like a landscape. The idea of abstraction pins itself in some accounts on something that is otherworldly, but you have to achieve it through something that's incredibly material, be that gouache, oil, paper, canvas, collage, whatever material you use to make art, it is material. There is materiality. So there's a fundamental tension in abstraction where you have to achieve your otherworldly, immaterial resonances by going through and by working with material. This is not as simple as it sounds. And when I go to the slides, I'll unpack that. So what is happening, what happens in Indian abstraction, I think, is precisely this formative tension, this push-pull between all of the frameworks that allow us to be operational in the world and what happens when you take them away. What world are you afloat in then? This comes up again and again. There's also a persistent preoccupation in Indian abstraction with forms of pattern making that come from what is sometimes, I think, pejoratively called craft. I would prefer to think of many of these forms as the traditional arts, the art of the textile, the art of the wall diagram, for instance. And there's also preoccupation which recurs in, for instance, the thought and work of Gaitonde, to name only one of these. Also Melli Gobai, who often talked about this. There was a great preoccupation with Hindustani classical music. And you can see why. Because some of what I've characterized as the essential dilemma of abstraction is also the essential dilemma of Hindustani classical music. It plays out, as many of you will know, in what is sometimes seen as the counterposition between Drupad on the one hand and Khayal on the other. Let's look at the primal scene of the Hindustani concert, of the performance. On the one hand, your music is shaped by geometrical patterns that are unfolding in time, that are temporal patterns, tal or beat, laya or tempo, the way in which you improvise with these, the way in which you play with speed and time and the evolution of your momentum. But you're pinned also to the bandish, to the song text, to words. So if someone is singing a Bhairavi Tumri, how are they doing it? They probably have, in fact, they certainly have a bandish, whatever this might be. And those words are those words are the material to which the geometry and the temporality of the pattern are counterposed. And that's where the music gets made. So I'll ask you to keep some of these thoughts in mind. And I mean, you might be convinced or not of what I'm saying, but I hope we'll discuss this as we go along. So I'm going to now take these notions that I've developed and make sure that I can share my screen. Okay. Can everybody see the screen? I'm assuming you can.
Yeah.
Excellent. The title card, which I suppose I should have flashed first, but here you are. Yeah. So I'm going as I speak. And by the way, I was thinking of how exactly to make my sequence. I thought about generation. I thought about chronology. I thought about various rubrics, and then I realized that I was sort of falling asleep myself as I was trying to make these fairly conventional rubrics, in which I myself have also thought, like we all have. And I thought to myself, you know what, let me mix it all up and see what happens. So this is what I've done, essentially. Also to demonstrate to the extent possible through slides, how concerns mutate. Concerns pop up in different ways in different generations. They are parsed, they are interpreted, they are given reality in different ways in different systems of thought, in different generations, in different historical situations. So I'm going to start with, you'll forgive me, this is a dear friend, Meli Gobai. And as Jaisal said, Nancy Adajania and I co-curated his retrospective earlier this year at NGMA Bombay. Unfortunately, the pandemic ensured that hardly anybody saw it. It was up for barely 10 days. But I have Meli here to, this is what he used to call his constructed canvases. Meli began with a great burst of color in the 1970s. His works were polychrome. He drew on the Pahari miniatures, which he loved. And
Ranjit, sorry,
yes.
if I can just interrupt, can you make it full screen?
Oh, how can I achieve that?
Just go at the bottom.
Okay.
Full slide view. Can you see it's right there?
Oops. New share, pause, share. Nope. Where?
That it's right at the 100.
108.
Then next to that, this. Can you see? No.
Hang on. Yeah. Not that?
No. Yeah, that one. That no. You were just there.
This one?
Like the right, that one.
Bravo. Okay. Fabulous.
Sorry.
No, that's fine. Thank you. Okay. So Meli, he began, as I just said, with this immense burst of color in the 70s, drawn from the Pahari miniatures, but also full of a certain vitality that drew away from his drawings of people, of objects that you couldn't really recognize unless you were looking. So there was a certain development of an écriture. As he came into the 80s, he moved away from color. Hence, by the way, the title of our show, Don't Ask Me About Color. He decided that these were to be sacrificed. Color, an overt sense of vitality, any connection with what you could retinally verify. And he tended, this is of course a work from 2006, but there was a long journey through works that really explored the subtle nuances of darkness and of simple linearity. And increasingly for him, the point of reference was the kshetra. He didn't use that word, I did in something I wrote about him. But for him, it was the field, it was the axis mundi, the mystical center of the world. It was the way in which Pythagorean relationships could be traced on the surface. And it had to do with evolving a certain sculptural quality to painting. So as he thought it out, he was really thinking about how to retrieve forms of mapping, forms of land, forms of design, forms of architecture. And these were very present preoccupations to him. So I have, in that same vein, moving right across the histories of, like I said, generation and how people come to these things. I have Seher Shah's work here. This is from her series on the capital complex. It's part of a much larger preoccupation on her part with architecture, with what architecture signifies in terms of human will, human achievement, the mortality to which humankind is subject. And of course, her own meditation, sustained meditation on the modern, on modernism in South Asia, because this is, of course, Corbusier that she's thinking about. So what does it mean to address and engage with Corbusier and his preoccupations with the imperial grid, with a determination to keep out any form of unpredictability, and then to regrid the grid, to portion it, to look at it as fragment, to look at it in terms of what actually happens to this sort of brutalist architecture, to the exposed concrete. And I would like to hold these images in mind and to see how they converse with each other. The Melli constructed canvas and this fragment from the Capital Complex work of Seher Shah, because just as Melli is thinking about decay, mortality, and vitality as a binary, Seher Shah is also thinking about built form and ruin as something that informs what we do as producers of architecture. And this is also a strain within our contemporary abstraction. In the same vein of thinking, I have Tanya Goel, whose abstraction, whilst it seems to be in dialogue with the great modernist trope of the grid, its journey to the grid is quite different. It's bodied, it's material. It has to do not only with ruin, but with demolition. Because as many of you know, her practice develops from using found material. Here, for instance, ground glass and ceramic and cement from sites where buildings have been demolished. And then she grinds them and uses this material almost in the manner of an old master, I want to say, where this material is then ground down and becomes her pigment. So I thought I'd open with this segue of how abstraction can yet speak to art historical and to our built form and ecological urgencies. So you've seen Melli, you've seen Seher, you've seen Tanya, and I have Anjum, who we most unfortunately lost very, very recently. And I know that all of us who are gathered here will have felt that loss to one degree or another. Anjum's work, again, whilst exploring a certain genealogy of abstraction, was always aware of the body itself and its experiences. I have another image by her later where I speak a little more in that context. But she was also preoccupied with what was happening to the urban context, what was happening to the urban ecology. This is a work called Dust Storm. And here again, when I look at it, I wonder whether I'm being invited to look at something through a microscope slide, or is it in fact a far larger meteorological image? What is it that I'm looking at? What forms of attempted order and incipient disorganization or contamination am I looking at when I look at this? What are we learning about the butterfly effect and how it radically destabilizes our normal understanding of being? As I said, abstraction takes on these large philosophical and existential questions. It's far from decorative, which is the charge brought against it every now and again. I come now to Gaitonde, who, of course, absolutely everybody knows, because he has, whilst I am very cognizant of the fact that Gaitonde has now a global saliency thanks to the museum exhibition and the work that's been done around it. This is extremely important work. The downside is that we tend, for whatever reason, to pull one artist out of the hat and forget that that artist was active in a certain context, that there were contemporaries, there were other people in dialogue with him. And when we think about Gaitonde, we really need to think of him as part of this much larger story, not as an exception, but as an exceptional member of a galaxy of profoundly vital artists and abstractionists. I'd also like to think about Gaitonde not through the usual optic of mysticism, for which I'm somewhat impatient with that. I would prefer instead to look at how he materially and practically achieved his work. So when I look at this work, which comes from the Pandol collection, all of these images have come from various collections, and I would like to acknowledge them. You can see them on your screen. I'd like to thank them all for having so generously made these images available. When I think about a work like this of Gaitonde's, for instance, I would like to think also of work like this that he did, which came out of his lifelong preoccupation with calligraphy and with script, with code and with decipherment, whether that was Brahmi or Kharoshthi or Devanagari or cuneiform. Gaitonde kept going back to this notion of the script of, and you'll remember that I made some remarks about how abstraction in one of its modes resists language. So you see that dramatized in Gaitonde's work here, for instance, in the series of drawings that he made through the 80s. I come back to this painting because I want us to dwell on how precisely this image was achieved. It was achieved through the use of the roller, through the use of the stencil. And I want us to think here of the artist not as mystic or sage or mage or Mani Baba, which is how people tend to keep thinking of Gaitonde. I want to think of him as an artisan. I want to think of him as someone who worked with his hands, with pigment, someone who cut those stencils out, laid them on a surface, worked that roller, checked to see how the density was going. And this is the artisanal Gaitonde that I want us all to think about today, not the Mani Baba, because silence is a marvelous thing. And since I'm going to be talking right through this evening, I'm very painfully aware of how important silence is. But that's not the only thing that carries the abstractionist through. What also carries the abstractionist through is precisely this deep and visceral relationship with materials, with methods. Melli too, when we were working on his retrospective, we went back to the notebooks that we'd of course known for many, many years, but there were detailed notes there of how to use the burin, how to make prints, how to cut leather. This was the apprenticeship also of the abstractionists, a very hands-on artisanal apprenticeship. I'm going to move now to Rajendra Dhaban. Unjustly overlooked, I tend to think, in accounts of Indian abstraction. Dhaban spent most of his life in Paris. But in his work, again, you find this incredible sense of the landscape in turbulence, the landscape in serenity, the way in which, as in this work, he evokes something that might well be a microscopically enlarged part of your body, but it could also be something that's much, much larger than your body itself. I move now to Prabhakar Kolte. In Kolte's work, again, over the decades that he's been practicing, there's been a constant sense of how to speak of what the voice leaves behind in residue in terms of script, residues and fragments and vestiges of script, and how to bear witness to paint that both gives form and takes form away. I've been always fascinated by his use of the drip, which of course has an ancient legacy within the modern. It goes back to Jackson Pollock's paintings. But here again, the drip reminds us of sometimes of the monsoon. And sometimes when I look at Kolte's work, I have a sense that I'm looking also at a wager on the ragmalas, on the notion of Mausam, on the notion of Shravan, what seasons are unfolding here. I think there are these rich cultural assonances and resonances that come through in work like this. I now come to Nasreen, and I'm going to dwell on different aspects of her work. Please don't kill me if your favorite abstractionist doesn't show up in my list of 32 artists, because this list is, this sequence is indicative. It's not comprehensive, of course, but I want to dwell on what seem to me to be salient aspects of our abstractionist situation here. This, of course, is a drawing of Nasreen's. Nasreen was deeply preoccupied with mark making, with the graphic arts, and with design. These were formative aspects of her work. And when I look at works like these, I inevitably think of the runway, the highway. These forms of momentum were crucial to her. I think notions of the binary between gravity and flight, between here and there, the standpoint of the person looking and the standpoint of the horizon that challenges you, these recur in her work. So when you're looking at work like this, you're not quite sure whether it's up or down or recessive or planar. You find yourself going back to your art history lessons and to think through, what is it that makes this picture plain? What is the kind of space that's happening here? And that is quite an achievement for an artist, to make you think about the rudiments of what art is made with in the most spatial, most precise way. This is a photograph by Nasreen, which I have here again to dwell a little on that threshold between the retinally perceived landscape and something that escapes it, which we'll see again and again in this work. But to dwell also on how there's, in her photographic work, for instance, there's a certain reference to the textures of the graphic arts, be that the woodcut or be that engraving. Likewise, in the drawings, there's a reference, there's a constant cross-referencing of the various arts in her work. Again, another photograph, again charged with that sense of where is one standing and where is the horizon, developed now in a very different kind of way. And I'm going to leap from Nasreen to the work of Monica Correa, who's, of course, a textile artist, a weaver. I can't help thinking of the many, many decades of conversation that took place between Monica and her husband, Charles Correa, the architect and urban visionary, urban planner. And it's marvelous to look at Monica's work and to think about how, even whilst she was so closely involved to the life of built form, in her work, she moves to the elements, to the natural world, here invoking the Dudhsagar Falls in Goa, but again, through an abstract vocabulary that need not have an objective or natural referent. Once again, when I look at work like this, I begin to think of the formal experiments, the reference to the diptych, to the art of the book, to forms of, for lack of another description, wall hanging that actually made for everyday art in traditional contexts. So again, in the work of a weaver who trained essentially in the US, there's also reaching back to more traditional forms of art making, and how those contexts and horizons come into her work as a contemporary. I'm moving now to work by Shobha Bruta. Many of you will already know Shobhaji's work, of course. But here again, to dwell on what I was characterizing earlier as this push-pull, this formative tension between the sublime as achieved through image and its materiality. The idea of using wool on canvas, what does that mean? What textures does that invoke? What invitations are made to us in tactile and haptic terms? Are we only viewers when we see this? What aspect of our senses are we using? When I look at this, I think of Barnett Newman's paintings. Of course, we all do. But Barnett Newman wanted his viewers to approach his paintings in a full-bodied way, but primarily really through sight. What happens in Shobhaji's work is that there's still a hint of other senses. We're being told that there are other memories implicit in wool. There are memories of winter and warmth. Archives of memory are being activated, which are intimate, which are domestic, which are regionally situated. So might abstraction also be an invitation to these more primal, intimate, sensuous histories? That's a question I'll leave in play. Wool on canvas, again, work by Shobha Bruta. But speaking here of that constant aspect in abstraction, which has to do with renunciation, with declining. You know, Melly, for instance, always used to say, don't ask me about color. Here again, there's an achromatic quality to what is happening here. There's a renunciation of color, and there's a movement to not quite the grid. It's actually the weave that is not yet complete. It's the weave that is in process. It reaches out to global abstraction to refer to Agnes Martin. It comes back to refer to Kabir. At least that's the way I see it. I'm going to move to Yogesh Raval, who was in my very first curated exhibition all those years ago, 1994. Yogesh's work I have here to dwell further on this notion of materiality. How might one dissolve the image and yet have a very strong physical presence out of very delicate materials? Yogesh's use of tissue paper, of kite paper, is something I've always been fascinated by, because it brings the material reality of the work to the very edge of the fragile, the vulnerable, something that can tear very easily. So we're poised with works like these at that edge, where you're somewhere between the fragile and the permanent, somewhere between the vulnerable and the heroic. And that again is a tonality of the abstract that engages us very, very strongly, because it reminds us, of course, of our own journeys through life. There's going to be a number of images now of Zarina Hashmi's work. Zarina it was a great honor to invite her to be part of the first ever national pavilion that we had at the Venice Biennale. As I've written in the catalog of the pavilion, India has had a number of appearances at the Biennale before 2011, but these were in the central pavilion in a space reserved for countries that didn't have national pavilions of their own. There were also two collateral events, but this was the first time we had an actual pavilion. And to include Zarina there was very, very special, because she incarnated. It's very difficult to speak about her in the past tense. She really embodied a traumatic period in our history, the partition, how that tore people apart, how it polarized people, how it opened up what had been a weave of histories into histories that then diverged. And this quest for home, this quest for belonging, characterized her all her life. And remember that she trained as a mathematician in Aligarh. So I want to bring her into the rubric of the abstract here, not because you can't recognize what's going on in the work, but precisely because that preoccupation with geometry, with mathematics, with recurrence of pattern is so prominent in her work. These might well be alcoves for lamps, but they're also, as the title suggests, spaces to hide. A number of these images that I'll show are from a 36-part portfolio that many of you will know. That's one of the works we showed in Venice, Home is a Foreign Place. And in each of these woodcuts, a place, an experience, a sensuous moment, some sensory memory was named, something lost was regained through the image and through the word, and in fact through the interplay of image and word. This, for instance, is Home. And we had a very, very interesting experience. I've retold this story several times, but there were many of us, the Indians present, couldn't read Urdu. But there was a Moroccan colleague and dear friend who came to the show, and he suddenly began to read all the Urdu. He doesn't know the language, but he knows the script. He makes a connection. So it's amazing how these, even in that act of viewing, we saw how work like Zarina's could speak for and speak to various kinds of distances. It could speak of gulfs and chasms. It could also create bridges. And that, for me, is one of the crucial reasons why her work is so important. It always engages you in dialogue. It makes you think about distances and about bridges. Falak, sky, moon. And I'm going to, at various points in the choreography of the slideshow, as you'll see, I come to that moment of the empty, of the no image. It's like the term escapes me. You have it in classical music where you come around and you come around to the Kali. Thank you. You come around to the Kali, where there's the missing beat, which is the void. It's also the plenum. So at various points in the slideshow, you're going to come to the Kali. Letter. You almost don't see it. It's bare outline, and yet it's communication, or is it saying that communication is impossible? And I'm going to cut from there to the work of Ishita Chakraborty. This is from an ongoing body of work that she calls Zwischen, which, as some of you will know, is the German for between, to be between and betwixt. Her own work gets done between an Indian and a Central European, a Swiss context. And the work resists even viewing. It works with gesture, with mark making, with scratches and embosses. It works with the rudiments of image, the achieved image, with word. And yet it resists viewing. You have to see it in the proper light. You have to see it in a certain way to actually see it at all. It's a marvelous way of challenging the viewer. Remember that we call ourselves viewers, right? What do we do when it's difficult to view? It's a challenge posed by abstraction, one of those challenges I was speaking of. Batan. which resonates very strongly with notions of ghar, of zameen, which animate the work of Zarina. And I'm going to move from there to a pivotal period in the work of Ram Kumar, who of course belonged to the first generation of post-colonial Indian artists. Ram Kumar began, he was actually a member of the French Communist Party for a while in his Paris days. He had an early phase, which many of you will be familiar with very stylized the term used is semi-cubist. I wouldn't call them that. They were stylized figures who were crammed into the frame, speaking of their alienation and their sense of anguish in an urban context or elsewhere where they were away from their own life world. He then moved in the 60s to this evocation of Banaras. He sort of homed in on Banaras, which is one of the sacred centers of South Asia. Once again, thinking about the heaped habitations, the ghats, what was that surging energy that both held people together and yet seemed to imbue their being with melancholy. And then he moved to, much later, through the 80s and the 90s, through another way of retrieving landscape. Both of these, both this Banaras work and this much later work, bring us to a point where you can see that a landscape is more than implied. But there's this sweeping momentum. There are these drifts of sky, cloud, vegetation, implied water, which really carry that static landscape away into some intimations of a larger cosmos, a sublime, if you will. I'm going to dwell at this point on the work of J. Swaminathan, who, as we go along, we see the incredible contributions he made as an activist who brought to light and sustained and supported artists of traditional heritage, artists of rural, or as Nancy Adjania has described them, of subaltern background. Jangar Singh Sham was one of his great successes, one would say, and not only, many, many other artists whose work we see in Bhopal and in circulation. At the same time, he himself went on his own journey from a certain commitment to abstraction to, in his late period, working with pigment, with Gerua and acrylic and oil, and figuring out how one might yet approach the world of symbol, the world of landscape-made cosmos. This is a work from 72, where he focuses on mountain, on the rippling of momentum, and on the bird. And that's the very, very attenuated, refined vocabulary he chooses to work with. So in that sense, abstraction as a renunciation of the plenary possibilities of what is available to the painter. Again, this is the kind of painting which, when I dwell on, I wonder, what is the intensity and density of that field? Is it actually planar? Is it recessive? Is one going deeply into it? Is one being carried along as one might be carried along by a raga in music? What is our relationship to this picture plane and to the depth it implies? I'm going to go on to look at the work of Akitam Narayanan. And with Akitam Narayanan, I invoke something that I'm not going to show, but I'm going to talk about, which is the journey towards an abstractionist relationship to the symbol that people like K.C.S. Panikar in Cholamandal in South India inaugurated. That was a take on the sacred, on the sublime, that went through a playful use of scripture, a scriptural calligraphy, a use of sacred and horological and cosmological diagrams, which yet became some kind of understanding of how one was placed in a larger world, in a larger cosmos. And as I look at this work, I think of how strongly it resonates with some of Swaminathan's very late work of around this time. Akbar Padamsee, untitled, but we know from internal evidence that this comes from the time when he was really working on his metascapes, beginning to work on the metascapes. And in a painting that's at the Jahangir Nicholson collection from 74, as I recall, we see how there was still a certain tentativeness to this process for Padamsee. You still see, not in this work, but in the work I'm thinking of at the JNAF, there is a certain reluctance to leave the trees and the stumps of trees and the forest and all of this behind. There's still landscape vestigially, but some energy impels the painter along to this kind of pictorial approach where mountain, sky, storm, twilight, all of these things are referenced, but they're not presented as such. And we're taken away into a larger understanding of that universe, which for Padamsee was always seen through the optic of a certain Shaiva metaphysic. He often recurred to this idea, this thought that, you remember that Padamsee was also a scholar of the Sanskrit texts. He thought very seriously about how the universe is produced through, in the Kashmir Shaiva terminology, the interplay between Shiva and Shakti, between Prakash or light and Vimarsh or discourse or understanding. And these metascapes, certainly the first wave of the metascapes proper, really evolved from these attempts to retrieve a traditional, if you will, but still living metaphysic. That's something else that I'd ask you to keep in mind when we think about this interplay between millennia of philosophy and formal strategies that belong in the present. The question we then ask ourselves is how layered is our present? How many tenses and temporalities exist within our present? Lakshman Sreshta, as Jaisal said, I recently some years ago, curated an exhibition of Lakshman's called The Infinite Project. And I came to that title really because it seemed to me that what was going on in Sreshta's departures from the landscape really is that take on the infinite that leaves names and forms and places behind. I'm going to show two of Raza's works, this one and one a little later. This is, of course, La Terre. And it, raises to mind all the rich, dark, amazing colors of central India and of Rajasthan, but also of the styles and idioms of paintings that have emerged in these regions. So once again, it's a cosmological take on one hand, but equally it's a revisiting of the archives and the reserves of prior forms of painting. And I can't help thinking that Raza, who had once been an art student in Nagpur, who had once been an art student at the JJ, studying with Ahivasi and Topeshwarkar, as he painted this in 1974, was he not looking back also at his student years, at the pedagogy in which he had looked at Jain paintings, Jain illuminated manuscripts, Pahari work from Nurpur and from Kangra, at the work of the Mewar school, for instance, or the Malwa paintings. So again, when you look at this work, on the one hand, you could see it as a simple marked painted surface, but it also holds these rich histories and ancestries of education, of pedagogy, of the journey of an artist through the many pasts that he or she inherits. Ganesh Haloy, when I first wrote about Haloy's work in the late 90s, there were so many people who would say, why on earth are you writing about Haloy, for God's sake? And I used to think, well, because A, I like his work. It speaks to me, it speaks volumes. I'm fascinated by his écriture, the handwriting, which yet the use of code, which comes through over against what he's trying to do in terms of evoking a particular landscape. And I can't help thinking that it is the landscape of the Sundarbans Delta, the larger Bengal region, and yet how he dissects it, how he analyzes it, and how some of this work goes back to his early apprenticeship, as part of which he spent a few years in Ajanta, looking at the murals, copying them, and bearing witness to them. And now that he's even been shown in the documentary, I, for one, am profoundly happy that his artistic merit has been so well and so wonderfully acknowledged. In the late 90s, I was a rather lone voice drawing attention to his work. And now I'm glad he has global saliency. Velu Vishwanathan, who, like some Carnatic musicians, he's better known to people as Paris Vishwanathan, because of course that's where he lives and works. What has fascinated me about Vishwanathan's work always has been his ability to work with acrylic, with casein, and to go into film, to work at the intersection between performance and film and painting. I remember one of his early films actually had to do with a sacred journey, in the course of which he brought to bear into his film and also into some of his painted work, sand that he had collected from various places in India. And I thought to myself, these notions of quest, of journey, of a relationship to earth, of looking back at ritual diagrams, but are looking forward to a certain non-objective formalism. How amazing that an artist should be able to have all of these different possibilities for abstraction present in his oeuvre, which also speaks to the abstractionist not as someone who's bound by a singular signature style, but as someone who actually is versatile and can self-disrupt and renew himself or herself. I now come to a set of paintings which, as I said earlier, have sometimes been unfairly characterized as neo-tantric. But when I think of them, I also say to myself, isn't this a kind of illuminism? Isn't this a take on, in the most forthright way, the source of all things, the source of a sacred light that is also incredibly worldly, which in fact invites us to not make these distinctions between the otherworldly and the worldly, the bodied experience and the outer body experience. This is Birende's work. And I've often thought about Birende's work and how it's been embalmed in this idea of the neo-tantric, but when you revisit it, all kinds of other histories open up. You see the history that connects this work to the work of the Orphists, for instance, Sonia Delaunay. It also goes all the way back to the Black Sun of Malevich. What is the kind of dialogue that's taking place here? With an Indic past on the one hand, with the Tantra, and also with these other sources of abstraction. So I thought I'd put in Raza's gestation, his much celebrated Bindu, in here to see how Raza's work in this vein might well be placed also in this kind of, this speaks to certain issues of history writing. It's conventional to see Raza as a member of the progressive artists group. I won't labor the point, I've been writing on this recently. To my mind, the progressives were a moment rather than a movement. And to isolate them in that moment is to do injustice really to their own work. I think there are multiple contexts in which they can be seen. Sousa, for instance, also has place in a history of Lusophone and Konkani modernism, which someone should engage with. People have, in fact, engaged with. Aurora Couto and Vivek Menezes in Goa have always seen Sousa through that optic, and it's a very productive optic. Similarly, I would like to hold on to Raza as someone who went through a JJ training that involved looking at Jain, Pahari, Rajput, and Mughal miniatures. I'd also like to see him as being somehow in dialogue with people like Birende and with Ghulam Rasul Santosh, the Kashmiri artist, long resident in Delhi, who also went through a lifelong engagement with what he inherited from his own specific cultural past, Kashmir Shaivism, Trika, the sophisticated the Tantra illuminations of Kashmir Shaivism. And in his work, I find that the figure is a stylized, mystical, if you will, archetypal figure. And yet there are all of those other formal concerns with light, with intensity, with texture that come through in these works, which I see to be really a part of the Indian modern. I showed a number of these works in a show I did called The Sacred Everyday in Goa some years ago at the Serendipity Festival. And I was quite gratified to see so many people gravitating to these works. Some less bodied, some more bodied, as you see, and always grappling with that dilemma of what it means to be a seeker between the sensuous and the haptic, and reaching towards something that lies beyond the body and the senses. Prafulla Mohanty, again, I was very, very happy to see that he's been shown now by Javeri Contemporary. Prafulla, again, is someone I've known for decades. Saw his work first at the Pandol Gallery, and then had a lovely time actually spent with Prafulla and his partner, unfortunately no more with us, Derek, in London. And I remember these many conversations with Prafulla, who trained actually as an architect and urban planner. And to make a journey with him through his formal choices, through his understanding of the sacred illumination of what he characterizes as Indic tradition, but also to see how all this has place in a practice, in a larger practice that involves also dance. Prafulla has practiced dance over a certain period, and as a writer, has written a beautiful memoir, for instance. So I have Prafulla here both for these works that you see. Here, for instance, you see a certain dialogue between the traditional arts of the sacred diagram on the one hand and Adolf Gottlieb on the other. But I also have Prafulla as an example of an expanded practice, someone who has commitments in writing, in dance, and in painting. I move now to Manisha Barik. I suspect I'm incredibly over time, or maybe not. Manisha Parik's work, again, I've been fascinated by constantly through the way in which she has these forms that suggest biomorphs, that suggest a more bodied presence, that suggest levels and planes of being that you can't even see, and yet that are being revealed to you in this way, in a way that is both attentive to our visceral experience and laying claim to that mid-ground between the painted image and forms of sculpture. Again, the heritage of the biomorph in abstraction comes through in this way, and alludes also, this work particularly alludes to water. It's called The Sound of Water. It's a synesthetic work. You look at it and you're invited to hear something. You're invited to feel something else. Works like this appeal to us to be more synesthetic in our... I'm aware that neurologically, very few people are synesthetic. I am, as it happens. But I think synesthesia still remains a promise that art can and does make, and it's an invitation. Another work that I've shown in the Sacred Everyday, Smriti Dikshit, it says mixed media here, but those mixed media include everything from fabric, from textile, to rope, to paint, to fruit. And another work that was very attractive to many of our viewers in Goa when we showed it at the Adil Shah Palace, not least because it really made good on its assumption, which is that it refers to the processes of the female body. And many viewers got that instantly in the presence of this work. They knew what they were looking at. And that speaks to how abstraction, which seems to turn its back on language and on everyday experience, can actually get through without the use of words at all. Anjum Singh, Belly Button. Again, I would dwell here on a certain microscopic abstraction, if you will, a certain preoccupation with cellularity, with the processes at the cellular level that can make or take us away. Sheila Makhijani's work, which I've admired for a very long time, both for its formal precision and the way in which it experiments in terms of its visualities. When I look at a work like this, for instance, I think of how it plays with the notion of shadow, of reflection, of the different surfaces and planes in which one is looking at this. It makes me think certainly of forms of looking and of looking through. Are we looking at some form of X-ray vision here? Are we being presented with some residue of an object, or is this image actually challenging us to think of the number of ways in which we actually see what we see? Not only the unaided sight, but also microscopic, telescopic, and radiological sight. I come now to Bhargashri, Sothar's work, which I have here because there are going to be two of her works. There's that in her work which reaches back to the lineage of op art, if you will. But also, particularly in this work, it reaches back to, I am certainly reminded of forms of painting from Mithila. How is it that you have a coming convergence of art from traditional sources, which are a living tradition, also design, also the 20th century tradition of op art, all coming into play? And yet also referencing landscape, referencing ecology, referencing all that we stand to lose through our own greed and what we're doing in our way of approaching the planet as merely as resource. I have now a set of works by Savia Mahajan, and you might wonder what they're doing here. I mean, are these not sculpture? Are these not properly to be placed in the domain of ceramics? And I'd say these are intersections at which they come into being. But for me also, they are abstract. And by the way, I have to say that I'm also deeply attracted to them because they remind me of one of my favorite artists, Anselm Kiefer. But what you're looking at here is deep geological time through the techniques of the ceramic artist. You're seeing a reenactment, a rehearsal of what happens in igneous or metamorphic processes. You're looking at what happens in deep geological time. In that ancient trope, you're looking at the book of nature, the book of life, but you're looking at it as something that's endangered, something that might be baked, that might be burnt, and that as you look at this object, as it invites you to hold it, you're also holding millennia of your planet's time. It's, in a strange way, it's a talisman, it's a memorial object. And I would like us to think of it as these things, if not also other things. Lithified Lives is the title. Lives Made Stone, Lives Made Rock. I come now to Hari Katragada, who I originally encountered as a photojournalist in a previous avatar. In this avatar, I'm immensely attracted to how he responds to an imagery that aspires to the elemental sublime, but that has its feet firmly planted on the ground. He recovers cyanotype, which is a wonderful form of printmaking with its heritage of blue and blueness and what that implies, but also working with bin bags, working with cardboard, working with everyday ephemeral material subject to recycling. So whether it's in Hari's work or in Savia's or in some of Anjum's work, I'm also captivated by the way in which processes of recycling come into being. It's almost as if there's an artistic ethic at work here, where artists are thinking about these processes of renewal, of care for the planet. Urvai Rai's work, again, I would see this in conjunction with some of the work that I showed earlier, at the conjunction between proto-textile and a certain kind of image, which seems to consider deep detail, but could also speak to us of these larger processes. When I look at it, I'm put in mind of the Japanese aesthetic of wabi-sabi, which looks, and of shibui, which looks at what is falling apart, what is decayed, what might be regenerated through decay. And I'm also struck again, of course, by in much of this work by the Haris here, or Purvai Rais here, by the intense dialogue with materiality, with material. Coming around now to the end, Mekhalab Bahel's work, which again, when I discovered it, I thought to myself, marvelous work here. It brings into play a variety of techniques, a variety of art forms, essentially through the repertoire of the printmaker, whether it's the domain of etching or of serigraphy or of the use of pigment on silk. I have a very particular weakness for printmaking, because I think for too long, it's been regarded as a secondary art. It actually lies at the basis of all art, I think. And here it comes up right into the space of the painterly. I'd hold this work, for instance, alongside the work by Kolte that I showed earlier. And you can see how there's a resonance and a dialogue, and yet a different set of choices being made. And I'll close with this one, which I have at the end, because in a very strange way, it reminds me of where this slide sequence began with Melli's work. What is it to mark off a field? What is it to populate it with tokens and traces? What is it to imply mapping when the terrain itself is uncertain and elusive? If Melly had his constructed canvases, Mekhala Bell has her use of acrylic and collage and ink. I wonder if you can see if I point my cursor here. I'm particularly intrigued by these elements of masking tape, which remind us that art will always be a work in progress, however accomplished the work seems. And that is, in fact, what abstraction reminds us of, that abstraction will always be a work in progress. It will never achieve stable, conclusive forms, because that's not what abstraction does. It's an invitation that is constantly held open to us to re-engage again with the materials of art and with the further resonances and intimations of art. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Ranjit. This was fabulous. A lot to think about, a lot to digest, a lot to take in and absorb. I mean, this was an amazing, I mean, you took us through so many artists, and yes, you didn't do it in a linear way. It was, like a cyclical, I think you were moving between chronologies and styles, which was, very refreshing, even for someone who has been studying abstraction. So I think, but we are a little over time. So
We are indeed.
but it's fine. It was beautiful, and I
Thank
didn't
you.
want to, even give you a warning or anything. It was just going beautifully. So, do you want to take a question or two, or should we? Because we may just get abruptly cut off.
Well, I want to thank the 91 people who are here, and there were 103 at some point. So I
Yes.
thought, that is absolutely marvelous.
No, and a lot on Facebook too, on the live, because they couldn't join here, so they are all there. And what I'm going to do is, there are some questions. I'm going to send them to you.
Okay.
And I think we should address them, because some of them are really important, and even I have a few questions, so we will send them across to you. So thank you very much, Ranjit. You've
Thank
given
you.
us a lot to think about, a lot to work on. And I hope that we can continue these conversations with you.
That would be marvelous. Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this, and I hope that those who've joined us have enjoyed it as well. Thank you so much. It's been
Thank you.
lovely to
Thank
meet
you. Thank you, Espas. Thank you, Renu. And thank you all for joining. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.